It's Christmas Eve, 1945. The war is over. The boys are coming home, and in a quiet trucking town in the hills of West Virginia, a family of 12 is about to sit down to the first peaceful holiday they've had in years. By morning, 5 of those children will be gone. Not found dead, not found alive. Just gone. No bodies. No bones. No answer that has ever fully added up in 80 years of trying. This is the story of the Sodder children and the fire that West Virginia never really put out. George Sodder came to America from Sardinia, Italy in 1908, 13 years old, alone, with a tag pinned to his coat. He worked the railroads, then the mines, then built something of his own, a trucking company hauling coal and freight out of Fayetteville, West Virginia. By 1945, he'd married Jennie, raised 10 children, and built a life that looked, from the road, like the American dream working exactly as advertised. He was also outspoken. George never hid his contempt for Benito Mussolini, and he said so loudly in a town with a sizable Italian immigrant community where opinions on the old country still ran hot. That detail will matter. Hold on to it. On the night of December 24th, 9 of the 10 Sodder children were home. The oldest, Joe, was still away with the army. The family had just finished a normal, happy Christmas Eve. Presents wrapped, tree lit, kids finally drifting off after the excitement of the day. At around 1:30 in the morning, Jennie woke to a phone ringing. A wrong number. A woman's voice she didn't recognize, laughing oddly in the background before hanging up. Minutes later, she smelled smoke. What happened next took less time than it takes to describe it. George, Jennie, and 4 of the children escaped the burning house. 5 did not: 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 10-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jennie Irene, and 5-year-old Betty. George tried everything to get back inside. The ladder that always leaned against the house, gone. Nowhere to be found. His trucks, parked right outside, wouldn't start, even though he'd driven them himself hours earlier. The rain barrel he kept for exactly this kind of emergency was frozen solid. By the time neighbors and the volunteer fire department arrived, delayed, the family always said, far longer than it should have taken for a call placed from a house that close to town, the Sodder home was a foundation and a pile of ash. The whole structure burned in roughly 45 minutes. Everyone assumed, understandably, that the 5 missing children had died inside. Here's where the story stops being a tragedy and starts being a mystery. Investigators sifted the ashes and found nothing. No bones, no teeth, no skulls, no fragments. Nothing identifiable as human remains at all. For 5 separate bodies, in a house fire that supposedly consumed them completely. Fire experts consulted later were blunt about it. A residential fire, even a severe one, running for well under an hour, does not typically cremate 5 human bodies into total, untraceable ash. Bone survives fire. It almost always does. The state fire marshal ruled the cause faulty Christmas tree wiring. George pushed back immediately. He'd checked that wiring himself, and besides, the tree's lights were still glowing after the fire had clearly already started elsewhere in the house. Faulty wiring doesn't usually keep the lights on. Then there was the ladder, the frozen water barrel, the trucks that wouldn't turn over. Individually, any one of these is a coincidence. Together, George Sodder became convinced somebody wanted his family trapped that night and wanted the fire investigated as little as possible. So why would anyone target the Sodders? George's public criticism of Mussolini's fascist government hadn't gone unnoticed. According to the family, a life insurance salesman had come to the house sometime before the fire, grown hostile when George wouldn't buy a policy, and told him his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. Punishment, he said, for the things George had been saying about Italy. Whether that conversation happened exactly as remembered is something historians still debate. It comes to us secondhand, decades later, filtered through grief. But it's the seed of the theory that has followed this case for 80 years, that the fire wasn't an accident, and that what happened to the 5 children wasn't a tragedy of faulty wiring, but something closer to retaliation, or an abduction made to look like one. Adding to the confusion, Months after the fire, George was told a Fayetteville watchman had confessed on his deathbed to removing the ladder himself. Separately, investigators later turned up a small pile of bones on the property. Sent for analysis, they came back identified as animal remains, beef bones, likely never even exposed to the fire at all. Someone, it seemed, had wanted the case to look closed. The family took that as proof it never should have been. The state closed its investigation. The FBI, after initially treating it as a possible interstate kidnapping, dropped the case within 2 years. But George and Jennie Sodder refused to let it end there. They printed flyers, offered a reward, first $5,000, then $10,000, hired private investigators who chased leads for years with nothing to show for it. And in 1952, they did something that turned a private grief into a regional landmark. They built a billboard along Route 16, right at the edge of town, with the photographs of all 5 missing children and a single burning question underneath, asking anyone, anywhere, if they had information. It worked, at least in the sense that it never stopped generating leads. A hotel operator named Ida Crutchfield came forward claiming she'd served breakfast to 5 children, matching their description the very morning after the fire, supposedly picked up by a car with Florida plates the night before. In 1968, an envelope arrived from Kentucky with no return address, a photograph of a young man in his 20s, dark-eyed, who the Sodders were certain was their son Louis, grown up. A private investigator traced it as far as the photo studio that printed it. And then the trail went cold, the way every trail in this case eventually does. The billboard stood for nearly 40 years. It came down only after Jennie Sodder passed away in 1989. George Sodder died in 1969, still hunting the truth. Jennie followed 20 years later, having spent more of her life searching for her children than she ever spent raising them. No remains were ever conclusively linked to the fire. No suspect was ever charged. No sighting was ever fully confirmed. The case sits today exactly where it sat in 1950, when the state legislature held its hearings and quietly let the file go cold, unresolved, undisproved, and impossible to close for lack of anything solid enough to close it with. Modern true crime researchers, journalists, and even forensic fire specialists have revisited the Sodder file again and again. Through NPR retrospectives, Smithsonian features, and renewed public interest around the case's 80th anniversary, none of it has produced a body, a confession, or a confirmed survivor. What it has produced is exactly what George and Jennie always wanted: the question staying alive, long after the people who lived it are gone. Maybe it really was faulty wiring, a random tragedy made stranger by grieving parents who couldn't accept an accident. Or maybe somewhere in the hills of Appalachia. Or maybe hills in Appalachia, 5 children grew into adults who never knew, or were never allowed, to go home. The Sodder case isn't really about one house fire in 1945. It's about how much a place like Appalachia can absorb without ever giving up its answers. How many roads, ridgelines, and small towns are holding a story just like this one, waiting for someone to ask the right question at the right billboard. We're going to keep asking. Next time we head deeper into those same mountains, to a light on a ridge that's been seen, photographed, and never explained for over a century.